This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Today marks the beginning of an end. There are just 5 days left for Missouri lawmakers to pass on several pieces of legislation before the close of this current session. STLPR State House reporter Sarah Kellogg is watching what's happening in Jefferson City, and she joins us live to share what she's seeing, hearing, and picking up on in the state capitol. Sarah, welcome back to the show, and thanks for taking time to talk with us.
Absolutely, Lane. Good to be back here.
Let's start with the budget. On Friday, the legislature met their constitutional deadline and passed a nearly $49 billion state budget. Of the budget pieces we've talked with you about in the past, including public library funding, a pot of money to increase teacher pay, a proposal to prohibit spending on DEI programs, Interstate 70 expansion. What is it that made it into the budget, Sarah, and what was cut from it?
So a lot of what you mentioned did make it in. I think obviously the biggest amount is that $2.8 billion project in transportation to go towards widening all of I-70. So that is going to take, several years. It's not going to happen overnight, but that will widen I-70 to 3 lanes across each side. So that was kind of the biggest change from what was proposed, which was around $860 million from Governor Mike Parson way back in January. And now we're looking at that much money to expand I-70, not in just 3 places, but across the state. So that was the biggest thing. But other things you mentioned, library funding is back in. The Senate put it back in. It was able to stay in the final budget. Another thing is $7 million that the Senate put in to basically eliminate the requirement for a local match for teacher raises, for teacher pay for a minimum of about $38,000. And then also you mentioned the DEI language. That anti-DEI language is not in the budget. The Senate managed to keep it. The Senate stripped it, and it managed to stay out in the final version.
So let's get a little deeper on some of those. And the DEI language is what you mentioned last. Why did that language provision not make it into the final version?
Well, when Senate Appropriations Chair Lincoln Huff mentioned it back in the Appropriations Committee after the House sent over the budget, he had said he had just spoken with countless departments within the government, businesses, contractors, and it just seemed like that particular language just was so constrictive and they weren't going to be able to do business with, almost anyone. I think the common quip was that, they wouldn't be able to keep the lights on at the Capitol because Ameren has a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. So that was a big problem, I think, for a lot of people. And then when it made it to the Senate, it was shrunk from applying to businesses and contracts to just being intergovernmental, but that still made a lot of people there wasn't a certainty, and that's what Senator Huff said kind of frequently was he didn't like to be uncertain with this budget that he was crafting.
Now, public library funding is something that we've talked about on this show. Sarah, what is it that got public library funding back into the budget? And will libraries receive the same amount they typically do?
Well, it was the amount requested through the Secretary of State's office, $4.5 million, and the House stripped it, and then the Senate did put it back in. There wasn't a ton of discussion about it. I don't know if maybe it was just not wanting to make news about it, but it kind of was brought in and no one really said too much other than the fact that people were happy the money was back in. I did speak to Majority Floor Leader John Patterson, who was a Republican, which the House were the people who stripped it. But he said, he goes to his libraries, at least Summit, with his kids about once a week, and that he was happy to see that money back in. So it's interesting kind of to see the reaction to this money now that it's back in.
Okay. Now, lawmakers also passed 4 additional budget bills for the upcoming fiscal year. Why are these bills separate from the state operating budget, and what are they for?
So these additional 4 bills, so the operating budget basically it's for one fiscal year. So it starts in July, ends in July. The other bills are for larger projects. So a lot of them are capital improvement projects that are going to take multiple years to accomplish. And so that's why they put these in these other bills, because it's kind of a carry-on from either the previous budget or it's something that they are expecting to take multiple years. I think the best example of that is actually the House initially did not have the I-70 money in the operating budget, and they had it in these 4 bills because they expected it to be a huge capital improvement project to take multiple years. So this is money that it also includes the money from the American Rescue Plan Act that they appropriated last year. Once again, it's kind of a reappropriation of plans, of capital projects that just aren't finished yet.
Now, this budget is roughly $1 billion more, not chump change, than Governor Mike Parson had proposed earlier in the year, back in January, as you were talking about. Do you think the governor will be happy with what lawmakers have passed?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of the things that he asked for are in the budget. I mean, the biggest change was that I-70 project, but reporters have already asked the governor about that, and he said, you know what, that was a starting point, and anything added to it to improve our infrastructure, he was a fan of, so he likes that plan. There's always going to be, sometimes he line item vetoes, which means you can strike out like one budgetary kind of expenditure. He'll sometimes line item veto things that he didn't propose. So there might be those here and there, but overall, I think he's going to be pretty happy with this budget.
We're talking with STLPR State House reporter Sarah Kellogg as we begin this last week of the legislative session here in Missouri. Now, on Friday, the Missouri Senate voted to extend postpartum Medicaid coverage from 60 days to 1 year. How many people will this extension serve, Sarah?
If my memory is correct, that's going to be about 4,000 to 4,500 people that are going to benefit from this new extension from just 6 months to a year postpartum. This was something that honestly, there were two sponsors of the bills on the Senate side, and one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. This was a lot of bipartisan agreement, not all, but a lot of bipartisan agreement on this issue.
So do you think that signals a willingness by both parties to work together on future efforts toward lowering what is really an abysmal maternal mortality rate in Missouri?
I think that definitely is an indication. I mean, this is something that the governor brought up in his State of the State speech to applause. I think there's a lot of factions that kind of be focused on reducing that maternal mortality rate. This was something that the legislature had been trying to do for a couple of years. I know it was a bill last year. I just didn't quite make it far enough. So it is interesting to kind of see this change this year and have it really get the momentum to cross the finish line. And this is just one of the bills. There's another one that's pretty close to being passed too. We could have two versions.
Now, to get to some news that was part of a lot of news last week.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, well, let me tell you, with the news of Kim Gardner's resignation as St. Louis Circuit Attorney, what happens to the crime bill that we've talked about on the show before?
I think for me, that is the question of the week. So when Gardner resigned last week, we were told from senators that the condition of that was the removal of this language that would allow for the appointment of a special prosecutor to come in and tackle cases involving violent crime, assault, murder, cases like that. So with that gone, the question is, what is kind of the status of this omnibus crime bill that Senate Democrats filibustered for more than 9 hours this past week. There was a lot of dislike and disdain for this bill, but there's also a lot of other things within this legislation. The biggest one being the control under the state board control of the police department. That is still technically in the bill. Is it going to be brought up again this week? I don't have a crystal ball, but it'll be really interesting to see what this new version of this bill looks like, what is included, and if there is kind of less of a pushback against it. We'll see.
And does it seem like there's a little bit less sort of motivation to push for state control now that Gardner's resignation has been put in? I
think that's a good question. I know that with the opening statements with this bill, a lot of it was focused on Gardner, and then the next senator, which was Senator Nick Schroer, he's the one who's been a part of this police bill, and he spoke why we still need it. But I think the request of giving Chief Tracy a year, of saying give him a year and see if he's going to, if crime improves, then maybe we won't pursue it. But I think that that's a more amenable ask than maybe it was a couple weeks ago when it was tied in with this prosecutor language. So I don't know, but I guess we'll see what happens with that.
Okay. Well, to the point, I guess, about public safety, there's gun legislation. So what's your best guess on whether lawmakers will approve a restriction on juveniles carrying guns without adult supervision?
That's not going to happen. The House, on numerous points when it's ever been a public safety bill this year, they have brought up multiple amendments that would either ban people under 21 from purchasing assault weapons, semi-automatic weapons. They have tried to limit, juveniles from carrying guns in public without adult supervision. That hasn't gone on. I can't remember the age last week, but it was a ban of kids like under the age of 10. I think it was even less than that. And House Republicans didn't vote for it. I do not see any version of that would make it to the finish line this year.
Well, Missouri's proposed legislation around transgender health care in sports has made all kinds of headlines lately. Sarah, what is the status of the anti-trans proposals that have been debated throughout the session?
So I think that they are exactly where they were when I last talked to you about this, which is both chambers have passed their version of the bill, and then they haven't passed the other. And so now, to be fair, so the House version, which is kind of considered a little more stricter, that made it over to the Senate. It has not had a hearing. Over on the Senate bills, the House has heard those, and they have passed them out of committee. So that one could be brought on the floor. So I think if there was any situation where a set of bills were to pass, it would be the Senate version, just because there is no time for the House versions to make it through unless they're added onto a bill somewhere. But from what the Senate says, they say either the House passes this bill or they're not done. Like, they're not going to get done.
Well, and Governor Mike Parson has told lawmakers that if they're unable to pass the trans sports and trans healthcare bills by this Friday, that he's going to call a special session to work on those proposals. I mean, how much of a motivating factor is that? I mean, does it guarantee that lawmakers are going to pass these bills at some point before?
Okay, that remains to be seen. I feel like the biggest chance is definitely who knows what day it might be. It might be the last day. It might be on Friday that the House picks up and passes these Senate bills. I mean, Senate leadership, a couple, when they first passed them, they said, never say never. Maybe we'll look at the House bills. And now they are adamant. They're like, nope, we are not hearing these bills. We are not hearing these House bills. Either the House is going to pass our bills or they would go to a special session. And who knows what would happen with that. But if it really were up to me, I feel like those might be passed on Friday.
In our final minute, Sarah, what else hasn't passed through the Missouri legislature yet that could be decided on this week?
I think one of the bigger ones is initiative petition reform, which is that process that gets issues on the on the ballot, right? Either changing the Missouri's constitution. I think the most recent one was legalizing recreational marijuana in the state. That was done through the initiative petition process. So the House Republicans have wanted to make it tougher. There's been different approaches to that, but it seems like they've kind of agreed on a higher voting threshold of like how many people need to vote on an issue for it to make it onto the Constitution. But the House and Senate are differing on that, and right now that bill is in a conference committee, which means they could sign off on it and reach an agreement, but we'll see what happens this week. I think that's kind of the biggest, I think, priority for Republicans left that hasn't made it across the finish line.
Okay. Sarah Kellogg is St. Louis Public Radio's State House reporter. Sarah, thanks so much for catching us up, and I hope you get to catch your breath during what's sure to be a busy week.
Waiting for Friday evening. Thanks so much.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.